Namaskar. It's a great pleasure and a privilege to be given this opportunity to once again speak at Ideas India Conclave. I would like to thank Shri Madhavji and India Foundation and all his colleagues who have made possible this significant platform that has now become a mandatory part of the annual calendar of policymakers in this country. In talking about leadership, I would like to limit it to political leadership in India. Leadership is a vast subject, and even leadership in the 21st century can be a very vast subject. But when we look at the world's largest democracy, I think it provides us lessons and examples that are important for a fifth of humanity and thus for the world as a whole. But even 7 decades after the world's biggest ever democracy was created, we have, I believe, a democracy that is still a work in progress. It is a real democracy. We have real elections. We have changes of government. But as some people have written, between elections, we need more work. And as I myself have written, we need a lot of reforms to take democracy to the last mile, to make it available to every Indian, to provide an equal platform to every citizen to have equal opportunity. Have we reached there? We have made progress for sure, but let me give you one statistic that shows that we have a lot of work still left. There has been a lot of talk recently about dynasties in Indian politics. The facts are out there. The facts don't get debated very much as the personalities do. But an important book called Democratic Dynasties, State, Party and Family in Contemporary Indian Politics by Kanchan Chandra gives some important statistics. By 2004, 20% of all Indian MPs were from political families. You would think that's progress from earlier numbers. But just 5 years later, in 2009, that number jumped 50%. From 20% of all Indian MPs to 30% of all Indian MPs being from political families. The important thing is, 5 years after that, in 2014, it has come back down to what it used to be a decade earlier, with 21% of the MPs, all MPs, being from political families. And clearly, this discourse is relevant because you cannot have a democracy that is dominated by families that more resembles a feudal system than one which is open to every citizen. Now, this change from 20% in 2004 to 30% in 2009 back to 21% in 2014 has not been uniform. I don't want to cite the party-wise statistic because I may be accused of certain things. But clearly, if you go into the statistics, and I urge you to Google them and go into it, you will see that certain parties have been reducing this number, and certain other parties have been dramatically increasing this number. Now, I didn't want to make this talk about dynasties. I wanted to start off by giving that statistics to point out that our democracy is still a work in progress, and we need to do work to making it accessible to all. But I want to spend the rest of my time here to talk about 3 aspects of leadership, that is political leadership as it applies to India today, and 2 trends which I think showcases these aspects of leadership. First, I'd like to talk about branding. Second, I'd like to talk about organizing. And third, I'd like to talk about charisma. And the 2 trends that I'd like to touch upon are cynicism versus optimism among the Indian political leadership. And the final point, the other trend that I want to talk about, is the transition from the argumentative Indian to the decisive Indian. So, branding first. Now, just like marketing in a commercial sense. Leadership also has certain attributes that comes from various aspects of the leadership. One aspect of it is branding. And in earlier eras, when the media, when the internet, when communications were not ubiquitous, a large part of the branding came from your family name, from your dynasty, which is why I started off by talking about that aspect of India's polity that still is a work in progress. But this is changing. In the old days, if a scion of a political family came up and asked for your vote to represent you, he or she stood for something. You know, he came from a family and he stood for something. Now, he or she might not be a chip of the old block. That's a different story. But the branding came with certain presumptions of qualities that a voter could think about. Not a very precise way of going about it, but it worked in the past. But with growing literacy, with ubiquitous communications, technology has made possible different ways of branding. Just like it has happened in the commercial worlds around the globe, so also in politics, so also in leadership. Today, taking to social media, taking to communicating on mass media, brands are created in a matter of weeks and months and years, where it used to take decades of a family name to create a brand. We all have examples of that. I don't need to go into names. Starting from the Prime Minister, there are several other examples in the country. But the majority of the political leadership still does not constitute that type of branding, taking advantage of modern communications. Similarly, organizing. For a political leader to be successful, he or she must be able to count upon organizations that mobilize on the ground. Here too, coming from a dynasty, coming from a family in politics used to help dramatically, because you had generations of contacts, of networks, of retainers that mobilized the vote, that spread the message. But here too, technology is disrupting it. Here too, it is possible today with modern communications, it is possible today with modern techniques to create those organizations on the ground. You're beginning to see that again with the use of social media to organize political campaigns on the ground. This is disrupting the old networks that used to be the mainstay of dynasties. You're seeing the result of this in mass media as well. Today, leaders have available to them, again through social media and other modern communications techniques, to bypass the arbiters who used to decide what the public should hear, what the public should consume, what indeed the public should believe. Today, the public doesn't need those arbiters. The public today is directly connected through the millions of Twitter followers, through the millions of Facebook followers, through the millions, tens of millions on WhatsApp groups that leaders can communicate to directly. This is changing the dynamic of leadership in a very tangible way, the results of which we have already begun to see just in the last few years. Charisma is nevertheless, the third point that I'm talking about, is nevertheless extremely important. It is not just a question about management techniques and communications techniques. In one of the earlier sessions, there was a mention about, the word charisma wasn't used, but there was a mention about how there is a difference in the kind of leadership that we have in India and in Asian countries compared to some other Asian countries and other countries in the world where people huddle together and charisma is not the main issue. Now, that may be so, and in fact, if you look at management literature, you will see, in fact, the comparison was made that the only kinds of leadership one talks about are the Steve Jobs of the world and so on and so forth. Now, there is equally a lot of management literature that talks about non-charismatic, head to the, focused on the nitty-gritties of businesses that build great businesses. It is not just the Steve Jobs of the world. But the difference is this. Yes, you can run organizations efficiently as a leader, focusing on many of these other aspects. But if you are to bring about seminal changes in your field, charisma is an important part, because you have to sell these new ideas. You have to convince hundreds of millions of people that a significant change of course is the right thing to do. You may not need to do it in a country like China, where you can impose a change, but in a country like India, there is no other way but to have charismatic leaders who communicate and sell the ideas that we need hundreds of millions of fellow citizens to accept and adopt. I'll say one more thing about charisma. A lot of criticism of politics talks about the lack of technocracies, the lack of technocrats. Now, I consider myself a technocrat. I have a technological degree. I have worked in a commercial organization. I have, in fact, headed a commercial organization before politics, which had thousands of people in that organization. And I can tell you, the big difference between working in such an organization and heading such an organization is that at the head, you don't use technocratic abilities. You need communications, leadership, and interpersonal skills to lead such organizations. We have seen dramatic contrasts in technocratic leaders heading the country and political leaders who can connect with the masses, who can harness technocrats and change the country. And the contrast is clearly visible, at least over the last decade, if not more. Two final points are the trends that I wanted to talk about. One is cynicism versus optimism. You have one kind of leadership in the country which is cynical, which looks to the past, which looks at the present only with the prism that of all the problems of the past which still remain. No one denies India still has a lot of problems. No one denies we still have casteism in this country. No one denies that we have many other social ills that we need to reform. But to pretend that it has not improved, to pretend that democracy has not brought about a transformation is just false. Cynical leaderships look to the past, look to grievances, look to holding everything down to the problems, whereas optimistic leadership looks at solutions, looks at the future, looks at the aspirations of the people. And again, you can see the dramatic contrast in recent years in India. But I can tell you this from personal experience. I have met leaders of both types. Sadly, the former, the cynical ones, outnumber the latter, the optimistic ones. And what a common theme you will hear in private from cynical leaders. I have heard this from cynical leaders across the political spectrum. Tell me in private, Jai Babu, kuch badalne wala nahi hai. Just bide your time, make the most of it. They say this in private. They wouldn't dare say it in public. That is cynicism. The optimistic leadership believes that things can be changed. And you can see dramatic changes being brought about structurally in the economy, in the politics of the nation, and the future of the nation. This is a dramatic contrast that we have seen again in recent years. Finally, final trend that I wish to flag today is a transition I believe we are undergoing from what has been described as being the argumentative Indian to today, I believe, getting to a point where we are gradually being recognized around the world as a much more decisive nation. One of the problems of having democracy, I have described myself in Parliament over the last 17 years, is what I call a democracy tax. Non-democratic countries don't have to spend time and effort and energy to convince people, to carry people with them. They can just impose their policy changes, and sometimes it works, many times it doesn't work. We pay a democracy tax in the time it takes to convince and carry people. And that sometimes has been held up as our shortcoming, as our Achilles heel in the past. I disagree. And I disagree for the following reason. History is not linear. Political developments are not linear. We have all heard of the phrase, the tipping point. Now, as an engineer myself, we used to call it critical mass, but in social science terms, in the last decade or so, the phrase tipping point has come to be discussed a lot. What it essentially means is that things will not develop in a uniform, steady, linear fashion, but a lot of time will be taken in the beginning stages to put building blocks in place. And once those building blocks are in place, you have this dramatic turnaround, and the growth is not extrapolated from the past to the future, but a dramatically higher trajectory. And we are beginning to see that. I think we have turned that corner. We have reached that tipping point. The decisiveness of India today and Indian leadership today is in stark contrast to the argumentative free-for-all that we have experienced for many years in the recent past. With that, I conclude my presentation. Thank you. Jai Hind.